The struggle of the Palestinian people for freedom is one of the most persistent, tragic, and controversial conflicts in modern history. At the heart of this issue lies a historic injustice, the forced displacement and occupation of Palestinian lands, and an ongoing campaign of ethnic cleansing and apartheid led by Israel, with the full support of global powers like the United States and the United Kingdom. To understand the Palestinian struggle, we must first delve into the historical context that gave birth to the State of Israel, examine the role of Western powers in facilitating this reality, and explore how modern geopolitics and power dynamics continue to fuel this conflict. This article aims to expose the systematic atrocities committed against Palestinians, the Western complicity in these actions, and the persistent refusal to hold Israel, the US, or the UK accountable. As global powers like BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa increasingly stand against these actions, the tides of international sentiment are shifting. The rise of anti-Western and anti-Israel narratives marks a significant shift in global diplomacy, heralding a new era in the fight for Palestinian freedom.
The historical stealing of Palestine. The roots of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict go back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where the seeds of discord were planted under British colonial rule. The idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, supported by the Zionist movement, was gaining traction in Europe as Jews faced increasing persecution. Zionism aimed to establish a Jewish state, and Palestine was seen as the historic and religious homeland of the Jewish people. The Balfour Declaration of 1917. The U.K. quote. S' role in establishing Israel began with the Balfour Declaration of 1917, where the British government promised the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The declaration disregarded the native Palestinian population, which was predominantly Arab, and led to a wave of Jewish immigration, supported by the British mandate over Palestine. The Palestinian population saw this as a betrayal, as they were the rightful inhabitants of the land for centuries. British colonial policy and the partition of Palestine. In 1947, the United Nations, heavily influenced by the British and Americans, proposed a partition plan to divide Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. This plan was rejected by the Palestinians, who made up the majority of the population and saw it as a direct assault on their sovereignty. In 1948, after Britain withdrew, the State of Israel was declared, resulting in the Nakba, or catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forcibly displaced from their homes.
Their homes marking the beginning of a brutal occupation that continues to this day. The creation of Israel can be described as artificial, a state carved out of the heart of Palestine with the backing of Western powers. The theft of Palestinian land was not a peaceful transition, but rather an orchestrated campaign of terror, violence, and expulsion. The new Israeli state engaged in a series of wars and military campaigns aimed at consolidating its territory and pushing Palestinians further into exile. This led to the creation of a refugee crisis that still affects millions of Palestinians scattered in neighboring countries and beyond. The ongoing conflict between Palestinians and Israelis would not have persisted without the unwavering support of powerful Western nations, primarily the United States and the United Kingdom. The US has been Israel's most important ally, providing vast financial aid, military equipment, and political backing in the face of international condemnation.
The UK, while no longer a global superpower, has historically played a major role in enabling Israel's creation and continues to provide political and diplomatic support. Its legacy of colonialism in the Middle East is inextricably tied to the plight of Palestinians. British leaders have, at various points, expressed support for a two-state solution, yet consistently back Israel in international forums, shielding it from accountability for its crimes against Palestinians.
Despite the evident atrocities, Israel has enjoyed a kind of political immunity in the West. It has been shielded from serious consequences for its actions by Western governments, media, and institutions that depict Israeli aggression as self-defense and Palestinian resistance as terrorism. This double standard in political discourse is one of the greatest obstacles to justice and peace in Palestine. The Israeli occupation has evolved into a sophisticated and brutal system of apartheid, characterized by ethnic cleansing, forced displacement, and the systematic suppression of Palestinian rights. This apartheid state is driven by the ideology of Zionism, which seeks to establish and maintain Jewish supremacy in all aspects of life.
Ethnic cleansing and forced displacement. From the moment of its inception, Israel has pursued policies of ethnic cleansing. The mass expulsions during the Nakba in 1948 were just the beginning. Since then, Israel has used a variety of methods, including home demolitions, land confiscation, and illegal settlements to displace Palestinians. In areas like the West Bank and East Jerusalem, Palestinians are routinely evicted from their homes to make way for Jewish settlers. Segregation and apartheid. The situation in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories meets the legal definition of apartheid, as described in international law. Israeli policies divide Palestinians and Jews into separate legal systems, with Jews enjoying full civil rights while Palestinians face military rule, restricted movement, and collective punishment. Palestinians living in Israel face systemic discrimination, while those in the West Bank are subjected to an oppressive military occupation that denies them basic human rights.
Gaza, the world's largest open-air prison. Gaza represents the most extreme manifestation of Israel's apartheid policies. Since 2007, Israel has imposed a brutal blockade on Gaza, severely restricting the movement of people and goods. The 2 million Palestinians living in Gaza are trapped in what is effectively the world's largest open-air prison, subjected to regular military assaults and collective punishment. The repeated Israeli bombardments of Gaza, which have killed thousands of civilians, have been condemned as war crimes by international human rights organizations, yet no accountability has been pursued.
Depicting freedom fighters as terrorists. The portrayal of Palestinian resistance movements like Hamas and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or PFLP, as terrorist organizations is a strategic narrative promoted by Israel and its Western allies. This branding serves to delegitimize Palestinian resistance while justifying Israel's disproportionate use of force. The Western media often adopts this framing, painting Palestinians who resist occupation as violent extremists, while Israel is portrayed as a democracy defending itself. Western double standards. Why Israel, the US, and the UK are not called terrorists. The label of terrorist has been weaponized by Western powers to delegitimize the struggles of oppressed peoples while exempting themselves and their allies from accountability. Israel, the US, and the UK have engaged in acts of violence and repression that, by any standard, should be classified as state terrorism.
U.S. war crimes and human rights violations. The United States has a long history of committing war crimes and human rights abuses, yet it is never branded as a terrorist state. From the Vietnam War to the Iraq War, U.S. military interventions have resulted in the deaths of millions of civilians. The illegal invasion of Iraq, justified by false claims of weapons of mass destruction, led to the destruction of an entire country and the rise of extremist groups like ISIS. Despite these crimes, the U.S. maintains its position as the global leader of the so-called war on terror. Complicity in global violence. The United Kingdom, as a close ally of the United States and Israel, has been involved in numerous illegal military interventions and atrocities. British forces were involved in the invasion of Iraq, where they participated in the occupation and suppression of the Iraqi people. In Palestine, the United Kingdom continues to provide political support to Israel, even as its policies lead to the deaths and displacement of Palestinians.
Israel's military occupation of Palestine and its repeated assaults on Gaza are acts of state terrorism by any reasonable definition. The indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, the use of collective punishment, and the targeting of Palestinian leaders are all designed to terrorize the population and crush any resistance. Yet Israel is never held accountable for these crimes and is instead hailed as a beacon of democracy in the Middle East.
In recent years, global opposition to Israel's policies has grown, particularly from the BRICS nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These countries represent a significant counterbalance to the United States-led global order and have begun to challenge the West's narrative on Israel and Palestine.
Russia and China have consistently criticized Israel's policies towards Palestine, emphasizing the need for a just and lasting solution based on international law. Both countries have historically backed Palestinian statehood and condemned Israeli military actions, particularly in Gaza. Russia's geopolitical influence in the Middle East has grown in recent years, notably through its involvement in Syria, where it has positioned itself as a counterweight to US hegemony. China, too, has taken a firm stance against Israeli expansionist policies, calling for peace talks and supporting Palestinian rights in international forums like the United Nations. South Africa, with its history of apartheid, has been one of the most vocal critics of Israeli policies. Drawing parallels between Israeli apartheid and their own experience, South African leaders, activists, and civil society have repeatedly condemned Israel's treatment of Palestinians. The South African government has reduced diplomatic ties with Israel, with many South Africans actively supporting the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Brazil, particularly under previous left-leaning governments, has also been critical of Israel's policies, although its stance fluctuates based on political leadership. India's relationship with Israel has historically been cautious, but recent decades have seen increasing cooperation between the two nations, especially in areas of defense and technology. However, India has been a consistent supporter of Palestinian statehood at the United Nations, where it has voted against Israeli actions in the occupied territories. Despite closer ties with Israel, India's support for the Palestinian cause has deep roots in its non-aligned movement history and its desire to balance its global relationships. As the BRICS bloc continues to grow in influence, its collective stance against Israeli apartheid policies could shift global power dynamics. These countries, representing a significant portion of the world's population and economic output, provide a crucial counter-narrative to the pro-Israel policies of the United States and its allies. The alignment of BRICS countries in opposing Western hegemony in the Middle East could lead to increased international pressure on Israel and its backers to end the occupation and pursue a genuine peace settlement with the Palestinians.
The ethnic cleansing of Palestinians is not just a relic of history, but an ongoing reality. Israel's policies in the occupied Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem and the West Bank, continue to aim at erasing Palestinian presence and identity through land confiscation, illegal settlements, and the imposition of a military regime over Palestinian civilians. The expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank is a key element of Israel's strategy to annex Palestinian land. These settlements, deemed illegal under international law, have been constructed on confiscated Palestinian land and are heavily subsidized by the Israeli government. Settlers often engage in violence against Palestinian civilians, while the Israeli military provides them with protection. The aim of these settlements is to create facts on the ground that make the establishment of a viable Palestinian state impossible. The Judaization of East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem, which Palestinians see as the capital of a future Palestinian state, has been a particular target of Israeli policies aimed at changing the demographic character of the city. Israel has pursued a policy of Judaization, where Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem are systematically expelled, their homes demolished, and Jewish settlers moved in. This policy is part of a broader strategy to ensure that Jerusalem remains under Israeli control, a move that has been widely condemned by the international community. The ongoing siege of Gaza is perhaps the most egregious example of modern ethnic cleansing and apartheid. the Israeli blockade has strangled Gaza's economy, leading to widespread poverty, unemployment, and a severe humanitarian crisis. The frequent military assaults on Gaza, which Israel justifies as a response to Hamas rocket fire, have killed thousands of civilians and destroyed critical infrastructure. Gaza remains one of the most densely populated areas in the world, with its inhabitants trapped in a cycle of violence, poverty, and despair. The international community's failure to lift the siege is a stark reminder of the double standards applied to Israel's actions. Apartheid walls and checkpoints. The construction of the Israeli separation barrier, often referred to as the Apartheid wall, is another manifestation of Israel's efforts to segregate and oppress Palestinians. Ostensibly built for security purposes, the wall cuts deep into Palestinian land, isolating communities, destroying livelihoods, and creating a system of control that mirrors South Africa's apartheid regime. Checkpoints throughout the West Bank further restrict Palestinian movement, turning everyday activities like going to work, school, or the hospital into humiliating and dangerous endeavors. The international community's role, double standards, and hypocrisy. The international community, led by the United States, the United Kingdom, and other Western powers, has consistently failed to hold Israel accountable for its actions. While these countries have been quick to condemn and sanction other states for human rights abuses, they have shielded Israel from any meaningful consequences. Veto power at the United Nations. The United States has repeatedly used its veto power at the United Nations Security Council to block resolutions condemning Israeli actions. This has allowed Israel to continue its occupation and apartheid policies with impunity. US administrations, whether Democrat or Republican, have maintained strong support for Israel, often citing shared democratic values and security concerns. This unwavering support has made any international efforts to hold Israel accountable nearly impossible. Western media's role in shaping the narrative. The Western media has played a crucial role in shaping public perception of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Media outlets in the United States and United Kingdom often portray Israel as a victim defending itself against terrorism, while Palestinian resistance is framed as violent extremism. This narrative serves to justify Israeli military actions and obscure the broader context of occupation and apartheid. The biased reporting also downplays the daily suffering of Palestinians and the structural violence they face. European Union and the inconsistent application of international law. The European Union, while often more critical of Israeli policies than the United States, has also failed to take meaningful action. While EU officials frequently express concern over Israeli settlements and human rights abuses, they continue to maintain trade agreements and diplomatic ties with Israel. This inconsistency undermines the EU's credibility as a defender of international law and human rights. The impending day of reckoning. BRICS, Russia, China, and the future of Israel. The tide of international opinion is beginning to turn against Israel, particularly as powerful global alliances like BRICS, along with Russia and China, take a more active role in condemning Israeli apartheid and aggression. As these nations grow in geopolitical influence, Israel may find itself increasingly isolated on the world stage.
BRICS as a global counterbalance. The rise of BRICS as a geopolitical force presents a significant challenge to the Western-dominated global order. These nations, particularly Russia and China, have positioned themselves as champions of a multipolar world, opposing United States hegemony and the double standards that come with it. Their support for Palestinian rights and their opposition to Israeli apartheid could lead to increased international pressure on Israel to change its policies or face isolation. Russia's involvement in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, has increased its influence in the region. Russia has used this influence to advocate for Palestinian rights and to challenge US dominance in the region. As Russia continues to assert itself as a global power, its opposition to Israeli apartheid could have significant implications for the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. China, with its growing economic and political influence, has the potential to play a key role in shaping the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. While China has historically taken a neutral stance in many international conflicts, it has become more vocal in its support for Palestinian statehood and opposition to Israeli policies. As China's Belt and Road Initiative expands across the Middle East, it has developed closer relationships with many Arab and Muslim-majority countries that are staunch supporters of Palestinian rights. China's influence in international bodies like the United Nations could provide a powerful counterbalance to the US and its unwavering support for Israel. India's position on Israel and Palestine is complex and has evolved over time. Historically, India has been a supporter of the Palestinian cause, stemming from its role in the non-aligned movement and its own struggle against colonialism. However, in recent years, India has deepened its relationship with Israel, particularly in the areas of defense and technology. Despite this, India has continued to support Palestinian statehood at the United Nations and has criticized Israeli actions in the occupied territories. As a member of BRICS, India's balancing act between its relationship with Israel and its historical support for Palestine could be pivotal in shaping future international responses to the conflict. South Africa's history of apartheid gives it a unique perspective on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and its leadership has been one of the strongest voices in condemning Israeli apartheid. South African civil society, political leaders and activists have drawn clear parallels between Israel's treatment of Palestinians and their own experience under apartheid. South Africa has taken significant diplomatic steps to distance itself from Israel, including downgrading its embassy in Tel Aviv and promoting the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions (BDS) movement. As BRICS strengthens its opposition to Israeli policies, South Africa's moral authority could galvanize further international action against Israel.
As the influence of BRICS and other global powers like Russia and China continues to grow, Israel may find itself increasingly isolated. This shift in global sentiment is already evident in international organizations like the United Nations, where resolutions condemning Israeli actions are gaining more support from countries outside the Western sphere of influence. The rise of anti-Western, anti-Israel narratives is part of a broader realignment in global geopolitics, where emerging powers are challenging the dominance of the United States and its allies. The Day of Judgment, a future reckoning for Israel and its allies. As global opposition to Israeli policies continues to build, many are beginning to wonder whether Israel will face a reckoning for its actions. The growing influence of BRICS, Russia, China, and other international actors opposed to Israeli apartheid raises the possibility of significant geopolitical consequences for Israel and its Western backers. Israel's isolation on the global stage. The growing condemnation of Israel from countries across the world, particularly within BRICS, could lead to Israel's increasing diplomatic isolation. This isolation could manifest in several ways, including the severing of diplomatic relations, the imposition of economic sanctions, and the restriction of Israeli access to international markets and resources. Israel's reliance on the US and its Western allies for military and economic support may not be enough to shield it from the consequences of its apartheid policies if the global tide continues to turn against it. Potential economic and political sanctions. One of the most effective tools that the international community has used to pressure apartheid regimes in the past, most notably in South Africa, is economic sanctions. If the BRICS nations and other countries critical of Israeli policies were to implement or promote sanctions against Israel, it could have a devastating impact on the Israeli economy. This could include restrictions on trade, investment, and technological cooperation, as well as efforts to isolate Israel from international organizations like the International Criminal Court. The US, UK, and NATO have long provided military, economic, and political support to Israel, ensuring that it remains shielded from international accountability. However, the question of when and if these Western powers will face accountability for their complicity in Israeli crimes remains open. The US and UK have committed numerous atrocities in the name of security and defense across the globe, particularly in the Middle East, without facing serious consequences. The hypocrisy of labeling Palestinian resistance as terrorism while ignoring their own violent interventions is a glaring double standard. The International Criminal Court, or ICC, has opened investigations into Israeli actions in the occupied territories, particularly concerning the treatment of Palestinians during military operations in Gaza. However, Israel, with the backing of the United States, has refused to cooperate with the ICC and has denied the legitimacy of its investigations. If international courts and tribunals are to play a role in holding Israel accountable, they will need the support of the broader international community, particularly rising global powers like China and Russia. The BDS movement has gained significant traction in recent years, particularly in Europe and parts of the global south. Modeled on the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, BDS calls for the economic, cultural, and political isolation of Israel until it complies with international law and ends its occupation of Palestinian territories. As more countries, organizations, and individuals endorse BDS, the pressure on Israel is likely to increase. The growing influence of BRICS and other global actors could amplify the effectiveness of this movement, leading to significant economic and diplomatic consequences for Israel. The conflict between Israel and Palestine is not merely a regional issue, but a global one, deeply intertwined with the broader dynamics of power, colonialism, and human rights. The systematic oppression of Palestinians, facilitated by Israel and its Western allies, has persisted for over 7 decades, but the global tide may be turning. The rise of BRICS, the growing influence of countries like Russia and China, and the increasing global condemnation of Israeli apartheid are reshaping the international landscape. As the world moves toward a more multipolar order, where US and Western dominance is increasingly challenged, there is a real possibility that Israel could face significant diplomatic, economic, and political repercussions for its actions. Palestinians have long resisted their oppression through various forms of struggle, and the global movement for their freedom is gaining momentum. Whether through diplomatic channels, international legal mechanisms, or grassroots movements like BDS, the call for Palestinian freedom is growing louder and more insistent. The ultimate question remains: how long can Israel, backed by the US, the UK, and NATO, continue its apartheid regime without facing a day of reckoning? The path to justice for Palestinians may still be long and fraught with challenges, but the shifting geopolitical landscape suggests that change may be on the horizon. The international community's willingness to confront Israel's crimes and hold it accountable will be the key determinant of whether the Palestinians will finally achieve the freedom and self-determination they have long been denied. In the end, as more nations and global powers align against Israel's apartheid policies, and as the voices of Palestinians and their allies grow stronger, the possibility of a just resolution to this conflict may become more attainable. Until then, the struggle for Palestinian freedom continues, with the hope that one day the occupation will end and the Palestinian people will be free. The Palestinian struggle for freedom is a profound human rights issue rooted in decades of occupation, apartheid, and international complicity. Since the forced displacement during the Nakba and the establishment of Israel, Palestinians have faced systematic ethnic cleansing, military occupation, and daily oppression. Israel, with the unwavering support of Western powers like the US and the UK, has maintained an apartheid regime that suppresses Palestinian self-determination. Despite the overwhelming Western backing of Israel, the international landscape is shifting. The emergence of BRICS, along with increasing condemnation from Russia, China, and other global powers, signals growing opposition to Israeli apartheid. Movements like Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions or BDS, continue to gather momentum, while the international community, especially in the global south, pushes for justice and accountability. As these global forces realign, there is hope that the persistent struggle of the Palestinian people may finally lead to their freedom and self-determination. The future of Israel and its occupation policies will be tested by these rising challenges as the call for Palestinian liberation grows stronger and more unified across the world.